Ahsoka, Balance of Truth, Book 1, Chapter 32. Kawani watched with growing enthusiasm as the ping on her wristcom beeped more feverishly. You may want to disarm the ones on you, Zar told her. Otherwise, I'll pick us out a nice, peaceful plot together with a wonderful view of the loveliest force current imaginable, and we can discuss how utterly foolish this whole plan was from the beginning, and spend eternity in blissful ignorance. Kawani chuckled openly as she fidgeted with the controls on her wristcom, bringing up the appropriate menu. She quickly deactivated the thermal detonator she had slung over her body, a resultant extinguishing of the small red flashing indicators granting immediate relief from certain doom. You do know how to charm a woman, she thought for his benefit. The beeping had flatlined, and she was both ecstatic and heartbroken. I wish I could have seen that, she said. You need to meet Sabine, Ahsoka said, her voice a little more distant than Kawani had anticipated. Kawani turned to face where she'd been, and saw her 10 meters distant feeling around with her free hand on a jutted outcropping of the black rock, her other hand holding the black cylindrical hilt. She paused momentarily to gauge her friend through the bond that they had formed, and more objectively, through the Force itself. As close as she felt at times to the Togruta, she also realized there was so much more she didn't know about her than she did. All Kawani ever needed to learn about someone was whether they were trustworthy. Was Ahsoka trustworthy? She would never question that. She did not understand the saber and wasn't even sure why she had ever asked about it or its purpose. The woman only had two hands after all. Help me find this vent hatch, Annie, Ahsoka asked, snapping Kawani out of her thoughts. She walked over to her side, silently curious about many things, but focusing on their surroundings. The rock beneath her feet was both porous and dense in pockets, exhibiting traits of cooling from intense heat at wildly different intervals. The heat was intense, yet she found peace in its embrace. Having no moisture in the air did not feel oppressive. Reaching Ahsoka's side, she eyed the issue her friend was having. The face of the outcropping was identical to the rock under her feet, having been reduced to surface slag and cooled many times over, it seemed. If it's here, Ahsoka, it's well hidden. Kawani almost shouted the words, realizing how loud the place was. The violent nature of the rock being ripped away at intervals by a rushing flow of its liquid state sent an auditory report with great frequency. That the same was happening across the globe created an ominous rumble that never ceased, with frequent interludes of loud cracks and bangs that left her somewhat disoriented and partially deaf at times. Use your gift, Kawani. I cannot see what she is looking for, but you can, Zar said. I don't understand, she thought. How? Channel the flow to yourself or Ahsoka and disperse it forward. I believe it may expose the entrance. But it flows through all things, Zar, but also around. The difference will be extremely subtle, but it should be present, he replied. Kawani focused intently on her small channel. She saw three diverse sources flowing into herself at various degrees, one up from the ground through her feet, a second coming from Ahsoka, and the third emanating slowly from the rapid flow of lava in the small canyon to her right. Ahsoka, stand back a little, she said, her friend replying with 3 steps back. Kawani poured her intent into finding what she was told should be ahead of her, wheeling the Force forward in an arced fan. The projection was uninterrupted and continued in all its intended directions without deviation. Did I miss it, she thought? Quite possible. I did say subtle, Zar reminded her. Again. She quieted her mind as reasonably as possible, shut off the input to her other senses, and closed her eyes. She felt time slip away, and she was aware of her slowing heartbeat and her blood quieting in her veins. All she could hear was her slow, deep breaths inhaling and exhaling. The Force was all around her. She could feel it swirling around her legs, wafting in and out of her at her waist and cradling her head in a comforting embrace. She decided against using it this time and coaxingly asked it to aid her in an important task. The tendrils of embracement flowed directly into her arms and hands without hesitation. Very good, Kawani, Zar whispered into her thoughts. She heard and acknowledged the remark, but quickly let it pass. focusing on the energy buildup to her fingertips. She outstretched both hands to assist in the flow of that energy and watched closely as it slowly penetrated the variegated stone before her. She noticed slight arcs in its flow at 4 exact points, 1 meter across and 2 meters in height. There, she said, slowly flitting her eyes open again, shocked at the immediate scene. Somewhere in the process, unknown to her, she had retrieved the lightsaber Ahsoka had tasked her with, ignited the blade, and plunged it into the points the Force had arced around. She dropped the saber hilt and rocked back on her feet, stumbling somewhat. The saber disengaged at the loss of pressure around its hilt as she brought her hands to her face in surprised awe, inspecting them both as they came into view. She turned to Ahsoka to see the same expression she knew she was exhibiting on the face of the Togruta. "Kawani, that was impressive," Ahsoka managed. "For the record, I had nothing to do with that, Kawani. That was all you," Tsar said. Kawani could not decide what to focus on and kept swiveling her gaze between the saber, the puncture points, and the stone in her friend's face. She had opened her mouth several times to speak, but words eluded her. How? Was all that managed to escape. "You've taken one hell of a step, Ani," Ahsoka said. Kawani looked at her, seeing the pride on her face. She had come to appreciate the warm look as Ahsoka's genuine admiration and respect. She was proud of her, and Kawani knew it without question. "I don't know what you did, Ani, therefore I can't explain it, but you will understand it in time. Your path will always be your own," she finished with her smile as she ignited the black hilt and buried it in the upper left corner point Kawani had uncovered. The rocky surface before her began transitioning from its black hardened state to varying hues of red and orange as Ahsoka connected the points, bright white rivers flowing from either side of her saber. As she completed the rectangular geometry, she outstretched her free hand and yanked the newly freed door clear of the passageway that was now exposed. Kawani raced into the cavity without prompting, picking up and igniting the white saber en route. "Ahsoka," a slight whisper came as Ahsoka made to follow the Mirialan. She paused at the entryway and scanned her view in all directions. The voice was hollow, echoing all around her, yet Ahsoka could not determine if it was, in fact, real or imagined. She looked back into the passageway, seeing Kawani moving forward with the saber in her hand, lighting her way. No, she wasn't the source, nor had she appeared to have heard it, Ahsoka thought to herself. "Ahsoka." It came repeatedly, reverberating and echoing from every rocky surface surrounding her. This time, the voice had the same familiarity she had felt upon entering the atmosphere. The same familiarity she had felt as they passed close to Vader's fortress. And again, that familiarity was not of Anakin, not of Vader. It was distant, and the voice seemed female. They were not words this time. It was a playful chuckle. Female. She looked back into the passageway. This time, Kawani was looking back at her, her face screwed up into a questioning expression. "Are you coming?" she asked, her hand gesturing with an open palm. She surmised that the whispers were not coming from Kawani and headed into the passage after her. The confines were tight, but not oppressive. A slight decline gave way to level ground as the passage led into a broader hallway that extended to her right and left. "To the right, Ani," Ahsoka said softly behind her. A sense of freedom washed over Kawani as the bags at her sides were no longer brushing up against the sides of the passage, and she dispelled a breath in conjunction with the thought. "Gear up now, you think?" She asked Ahsoka as she dropped the bags to the ground. "Not yet, I think. But lightly arm and grab that slicing kit you scrounged from the ship," Ahsoka responded, emphasizing lightly. Kawani patted the outside pocket of her pants with a wink. "Never leave home without it." Ahsoka dropped the bags she had been hauling and kicked them over to the rest next to Kawani's. "Let's go," she said, blindingly grabbing her right arm, the Mirialan collaring one last blaster from her bags. They padded forth, the light from the raised saber illuminating piping above them. To either side, various control devices and panels came into view sporadically, waiting until the last second to materialize into a definition. The air was bland, having no property beyond itself. There were no offending scents, but there was also no identifying sense that the air usually carried. Given the seal they had just broken, Kawani found it odd but understandable. It was, however, much cooler. What is this place? It had some serious power requirements at some point, she pointed out with an upward glance. It was a control monitoring station for the perimeter stasis fields, Ahsoka said. During the Clone Wars, this was a very industrious planet and provided raw material to the Separatists. She shook her head slightly. When did I become the history teacher? How does that even relate to Force-sensitive children? I don't understand, Kawani asked unapologetically. It doesn't relate at all. There was far more going on than anyone had realized then. The Chancellor's reach was infinite, and his methods were a mystery, Ahsoka said. Just up here. The hallway gave way to a half-open door, sheared from its hinge at the top, and stuck fast into the twisted metal the flooring had become of the room it opened into. Let me go first, Donnie. Good plan, Kawani responded. Careful, the floor is pitched. Severely, Ahsoka said seconds later as Kawani heard a slight whoosh and a small breath escape her friend. It's also covered in dust and debris. We're going to have to work quickly. This isn't entirely stable. Kawani had a quick retort and was ready to sling but decided against it. She didn't want to be in here any longer than they had to be. The hallway and the room were neither confined nor constricting, but she felt an overwhelming sense of foreboding nonetheless. This room opened into an atrium of sorts beyond, Ahsoka said with her hand outstretched, as Kawani struggled to get a foothold against a twisted metal stanchion just inside the mutilated door. The last time I was here, she corrected herself, I nearly didn't make it back. Kawani stared at the naked rock, illuminated by an eerie shadow pocked gray with Ahsoka's blade. Doesn't open into much of anything now, she pointed out as she stared at the wall of rock and twisted metal Ahsoka had been motioning toward. How did that happen? She asked, referring to the mixture the wall had become of rock within metal and vice versa. Ahsoka returned to gaze at the wall. We're sitting above a caldera formed by the rivers converging. The heat must increase and then cool periodically to create that. She returned to look at the bank of control consoles along the wall to the left. Over there, she said, pointing to the farthest from the rocky metal wall. I hope you have that slicing kit, Annie. There's a terminal under the monitor. Kawani, taking all that information in, was sure logic equated to turning right around and finding another ship. Ahsoka, slicing isn't the problem. I could do that in my sleep. And this, she gestured around the room, is ages old. She paused momentarily to regain her footing as she swung her left foot into place against a girder that should not have been where it was. Something shifted within the room's structure, and a loud snap echoed throughout, deafening both inhabitants for a few seconds. I'm not even going to ask, Kawani said, moving ever closer to the terminal, her head ringing. I have some power cells with me. I should be able to link a few together to power up that workstation. Didn't think of that, did you? She yelled, not realizing how much of an effect the noise had had. She hadn't. Those issues generally take care of themselves. Well, mostly, Ahsoka said with a shrug. Droid would be handy. Kawani, swinging her hands in front of her, reached the monitor, snugged her right knee between the tool console units, and set to work with the slicing tools on the terminal power conduits. Take care of themselves, she said to herself. She removed the cover and fed 2 power cells from the duffel into auxiliary slots. Hold that thing steady, will you? She almost shouted at Ahsoka. I can't see what I'm doing. A tremor, slight at first, grew in intensity and began vibrating through the room. The door screeched a little further from its hinges, and an exterior panel dislodged from one of the other workstations, banging loudly on its journey toward the rock and metal wall at the bottom of the canted room. A green light cascaded from within the confines of the conduit housing, and a monitor above the data terminal began booting up. Ahsoka was trying to get a little closer to Kawani to assist with lighting, and slipped for an instant, banging her arm on a power housing that had long since seen its final days. Wincing in mild pain, she held her saber hilt higher for Kawani's benefit. The screen was beginning to provide its backlight in front of the Mirialan, and she started easing a long metal terminal jack into the port in front of her with one hand. Fumbling for her datapad in the other, she deftly snapped in the link cable between the tools of her craft. "I'm in," she said. Ahsoka wasn't sure she had heard that right as she rubbed her elbow. "Already?" "Hey, it's what I do," she responded. "Well, part of what I do." She concentrated heavily on the datapad, working through security measures, encryption parameters, and bioaccess authentication, she said to herself. Easy enough to circumnavigate. How old is this stuff? "What is bioaccess?" Tsar began. "Not now, Tsar," Kawani thought. Her hands diligently worked the monitor's keypad and her own datapad simultaneously, and she momentarily eased up on her left to take the pressure off her aching knee. The room was suddenly rocked by another jolt of tremors, cascading both occupants in a fine layer of dust, stone, and scree. The top hinge gave way on the thick metal door, which screeched with painful authority toward Ahsoka, holding the saber above Kawani's head. It gouged itself into the floor to stop within a few centimeters. They both clenched their eyes shut to absurdly staunch the aggravating sound. "Ani, we're running out of time," Ahsoka said. I know. "I'm into the mainframe. Need to know what I'm looking for," Kawani said. Ahsoka looked over Kawani's shoulder and pointed to a grouping of files off to the right of the screen. "Power settings?" Kawani responded, seriously doubting that could be correct. "No, behind it. Delete that overlaying file, Ani." Kawani shrugged and deleted it, uncovering a blank screen. "Hang on," she said, trusting her friend's intuition. She had a few more tricks up her sleeve. She relayed her datapad to the terminal core and refreshed the screen. "There," Ahsoka said with much more authority than was intended. Kawani hurriedly tapped on the newly exposed data link and was congratulated by a boot screen and a loading bar. "What novelty! These I am familiar with," Tsar was ecstatic. "Just how old are you anyway?" Kawani thought. The screen refreshed yet again to multiple files. "Ahsoka? I don't know. They aren't even labeled in a language I am familiar with. Just grab them all." Kawani looked at the scrawling text block to the side of each data file. Unsure of the language, she jammed the data cylinder from the pad into the terminal's cylinder port and copied everything. "What is a Bora?" she said. "Where do you see that?" Ahsoka asked. "Second file in," Kawani responded. "Sorry, I thought you understood Mune." "Mune? Munilinst? That doesn't make any sense." Another tremor rocked the foundations of the room. A cadence of thunderous booms followed another loud snap as the room pitched forth another 5 degrees, sending Ahsoka sprawling into the rock metal wall and wedging Kawani's prone knee between the two control stations again. "Ah!" she growled furiously, feeling the pressure her kneecap was enduring. Swiveling, she pulled the cylinder, yanked out the terminal jack, and stashed her datapad back into its pocket, tossing the other contents of her hand into the duffel slung over her head. Turning to Ahsoka, who was shaking her head, she heard the door begin to squeal against the floor in protest. She looked from Ahsoka to the door, then back to Ahsoka. "Ahsoka!" she yelled, then watched absently as her friend was still shaking off the effects of the fall. The squealing turned into a raucous grating as another tremor rocked the room. Then there was no sound at all. The door was free-falling right where Ahsoka lay. "Ahsoka!" shouted Kawani, closing her eyes. She stretched out as far as she could to no avail. She had no time to concentrate on the Force. "Oh dear," Tsar said. Kawani felt her right wrist kick back in recoil, then heard a cacophonous metallic slam, an unmistakable crunch of bone. "Ahsoka!" she screamed again and pulled her knee with all her might, feeling the kneecap give way, tearing cartilage in the process with a stomach-churning gurgle. "Ahsoka, no!" Tears were streaming down her face, and all else was forgotten as she slid her way down to the door and came to rest against the rock. The room had pitched so far that the rock and metal wall was almost the floor itself as she got her feet under her, favoring her left side. She had to peer over the door to see where Ahsoka lay, but her fall extinguished the saber. Kawani felt for Ahsoka's other saber at her hip, but realized she was already holding something in her right hand. It felt like a saber hilt, but it was neither of Ahsoka's. She'd tried playing with her fingers, playing with her fingers around its surface but was inhibited by something on her right wrist. She attempted to inspect by fumbling with the fingers on her other hand and was shocked to feel a cable running from under the bottom side of the van brace on her right arm. She grabbed the hilt with the other hand and found it easier to navigate. Although she was given to find an actuator, she could not help but notice how light the thing was, how smooth it felt in her hand. Finally, she saw the switch and activated it, filling the room with a brilliant purple hue. Please consider a like and sub. It is YouTube's way of getting these to more people. I am less concerned with subs as I am with getting the story out there, and I need your help to do that. Thank you.